Welcome to Kat Has Questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. On Christmas Eve in 2002, a pregnant woman disappears. By that night, her husband is on the news, calm, composed, asking for help finding her. But within days, before there's a body, before there's a confirmed crime scene, people are already certain they know what happened. Not because of what was found, but because of how it looked. Hello. Welcome back to Kat Has Questions. I'm your host, Kat. Today's case is one that I actually had a request to cover, so we are diving into it today. Today's case is one people feel very sure about. But when you actually step back and look at it, what we know and how it came to be known doesn't always line up as cleanly as they seem. Today, we are talking about the murder of Laci Peterson. Laci Peterson was born Laci Denise Roca on May 4th, 1975. She was the younger of two children born to Sharon Anderson and Dennis Robert Roca. She had an older brother named Brent. Her parents had met in high school and owned a dairy farm west of Escalon, California. Laci worked on the dairy farm from a young age and also enjoyed gardening with her mother. Sadly, Laci's parents divorced in 1977 when she and her brother were young. Subsequently, their mother moved with the children to Modesto. Laci still visited her father at the dairy farm on weekends. By all accounts, it seemed they did well with raising their kids despite the separation, as well as you can in that situation. After the divorce, Laci's mother developed a long-term relationship with Ron Gransky. Although they never married, Gransky would help raise the children from the time Laci was 2 years old, so was really just definitely a father figure in her life. Laci was a cheerleader in junior high and high school. After graduating high school, she attended California.Polytechnic State University, majoring in ornamental horticulture, which to me sounds very exciting. By all accounts, she was steady, warm, reliable. The kind of person who showed up. The kind of person people trusted. While attending Cal Poly, Laci would occasionally visit a restaurant called Pacific Cafe in Morro Bay to see a friend of hers who worked there. Scott Peterson also worked at Pacific Cafe, and this is where Laci and Scott met. Laci sent Scott her phone number, and she had also told her mother that she met the man that she would marry. Scott later called Laci, and they began dating. So let's talk a little bit more about this man that Laci had met and eventually married. So Scott Peterson was born on October 24th, 1972 in San Diego, California, to Lee Arthur Peterson, who owned a crate packaging company, and Jackie Helen, who owned a boutique called The Put On. Lee and Jackie had 6 children from previous relationships. Scott was their only child together. As a child, Scott shared a bedroom with his half-brother John in the family's 2-bedroom apartment. Scott began playing golf at an early age. And by age 14, he could beat his father at the game, so he was really good. For a time, Scott had dreams of becoming a professional golfer. And he was actually teammates with the future pro Phil Mickelson at the University of San Diego High School. So for all my golf people out there, you know Phil Mickelson. By the end of high school, he was one of the top junior golfers in San Diego. In 1990, Scott enrolled at Arizona State University, where Mickelson had also enrolled, actually. And he was on a partial golf scholarship. Scott's father, Lee, later testified that Scott was discouraged by the considerable competition that Mickelson and another unnamed future pro presented when they were all playing together. While there, Scott was actually kicked off the golf team when another younger player named Chris Couch was taken out drinking by Scott when he was visiting Arizona State for a recruiting trip. Chris Couch's father, kid who was being recruited, his dad, complained to the coach, who subsequently kicked Scott off the golf team. After this happened, Scott Peterson then transferred to Cuesta College and then California Polytechnic State University. So he kind of jumped around a little bit when he was in college. Initially, he planned to major in international business, but Scott ultimately graduated with a degree in agricultural business in 1998. Professors who taught Scott described him as a model student. One of his ag business professors commented, Quote, "I wouldn't mind to have a class full of Scott Petersons," quote. So as I mentioned, Scott and Laci met in 1994 while they both attended Cal Poly and bumped into each other at a restaurant where he worked and she frequented. And the rest was history. They began dating, and as the relationship grew more serious, this was at the same time as Scott kind of putting aside his dreams of professional golf in order to focus on a business career. The couple dated for 2 years and eventually moved in together. In 1997, after Laci graduated, they got married. While Scott finished his senior year, Laci took a job in nearby Prunedale. So things seem to be going well. They're finishing school, starting careers as a happy little family. However, around this time is when prosecutors later stated that Scott engaged in his first extramarital affair. So it seemed to start early. Though they did not reveal any details of this relationship, everything seems picture perfect, but clearly everything was not all sunshine and roses for them. After Scott graduated in 1998, the Petersons opened a sports bar in San Luis Obispo. They opened a sports bar called The Shack, eventually putting it up for sale and moving back to Laci's hometown of Modesto, California, to start a family. In October 2000, the Petersons purchased a home in an upscale neighborhood near East La Loma Park. Laci took a part-time job as a substitute teacher, and Scott got a job with Trade Corp USA, a newly founded fertilizer company, for which he earned a very good salary. They were comfortable, they were settling in, starting a life and a family together. Laci's family, including her mother and younger sister, related that she devoted much of her energy towards being the perfect housewife. She enjoyed cooking, entertaining, and watching Martha Stewart. In 2002, so about 2 years after moving to Modesto, Laci discovered she was pregnant. Her due date was February 10th of 2003. The couple had planned to name their son Connor. From the outside, their life looked stable. They had a home, a baby on the way, and a normal Christmas approaching, until the morning of December 24th. So we're going to go back to December 23rd, 2002 at 5:45 p.m. Laci and Scott went to Salon, the workplace of Laci's sister, Amy. Amy cut Scott's hair as she did each month. So this was a normal, regular occurrence. It makes sense to me that he's getting his hair cut before the holidays. Scott offered to pick up a fruit basket that Amy had ordered because he would be playing golf the next day at a course near the retailer. Prosecutors say Scott also told other people he would play golf on Christmas Eve. This is important later, so just keep that in mind. Laci's mother, Sharon, spoke with Laci on the telephone around 8:30 p.m. on December 23rd. So after the haircuts, Laci talks to her mom on the phone, 8:30 p.m. The last 3 people known to have spoken to Laci before she disappeared were Amy, her sister, Sharon, her mother, and Scott. As far as everyone knows, it was an uneventful Christmas Adam, as I like to call it. On December 24th, so now Christmas Eve, the next morning, Scott told police that he last saw his wife at about 9:30 a.m. that morning, when he left to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina. He said Laci was watching a Martha Stewart TV show and was planning to do some things around the house, such as preparing to mop the floor, bake cookies, and walk the family dog, Mackenzie, to a nearby park. The first kind of inky thing here is that Scott told multiple people he was golfing on Christmas Eve, and now he's telling the police he went fishing that day. So, a neighbor of the Petersons, named Karen Service, said that she found the Petersons' dog, a golden retriever, alone outside the home, so she returned him to the Petersons' backyard at around 10:30 a.m. I've seen mixed reporting of whether the dog had a leash attached to him, as though he'd been on a walk. Another neighbor, Mike Chavetta, confirmed this information when he said he saw Mackenzie at about 10:45 a.m. as he played catch with his own dog. The neighbor who put the dog in the Petersons' yard did not observe that anything was out of place other than the loose dog. So that's 10:30, 10:45 in the morning. And then at about 2:15 p.m., Scott left a message for Laci stating, "Hey, beautiful, I'm leaving Berkeley," which was that fishing marina that he said he was at. Scott said when he returned home that afternoon, Laci's car was in the driveway, and the house was empty. Her purse was still inside, her keys, her shoes. Nothing really seemed out of the ordinary. He also said that he found Mackenzie in their backyard. which would line up with the neighbor ended up putting Mackenzie back there. Afterward, Scott showered and washed his clothes. A neighbor of Scott's later said that Scott had knocked on his door, asking him if he had seen Laci. The neighbor and his wife both testified overhearing Scott saying that he had been golfing that day and had tried to call Laci. So, are you golfing or are you fishing? There were no signs of forced entry, no immediate evidence of a struggle. Scott called his mother-in-law, Sharon, to ask if Laci was with her. Sharon subsequently said that call was when she learned that Laci was missing. Scott and Laci's stepfather both reported Laci missing. The police received the report of her disappearance shortly before 6 p.m. on December 24th. A relative of Laci's would also later testify that when friends and family began gathering at the Petersons' home that night, Scott had said he had gone to play golf earlier. And at the time of her disappearance, Laci was 27 years old and 7.5 months pregnant, with a due date of February 10th, 2003. The story immediately attracted nationwide media interest. Modesto Police Detective Alan Brocchini and John Bueller responded to the missing person call and became the lead investigators for the case. Upon their arrival at the Peterson home, the detectives interviewed Scott and performed a cursory search of the home. Scott told detectives he had been fishing for sturgeon at the Berkeley Marina, approximately 90 miles from the couple's Modesto home. The detectives found Laci's keys, wallet, sunglasses, and purse in a closet, and they began organizing a search of the area. The following day, over 900 of Laci's family, friends, and neighbors searched the neighborhood and posted missing person flyers. At a press conference, Detective Allen said police did not believe Laci left without contacting her family. They said it was completely out of character for her. Over 30 Modesto police and firefighters on foot, horseback, bicycles, and watercraft used canine units and searchlight-equipped helicopters to search Dry Creek and the surrounding area. A $25,000 reward was offered and later was increased to $500,000 for information leading to Laci's safe return. Posters, blue and yellow ribbons, and flyers were circulated. The original basic version of LaciPeterson.com website was launched by the husband of one of Laci's friends. Family, friends, and volunteers set up a command center at the Red Lion Hotel to take phone calls, record developments, and circulate information. Over 1,500 volunteers distributed information, worked at the command center, searched for Laci, and held candlelight vigils with Scott for Laci. Although detectives did not initially consider the case suspicious, they did suspect foul play almost immediately and became increasingly suspicious of Scott as they continued their investigation into Laci's disappearance. Bueller told ABC News in 2017, quote, "I suspected Scott when I first met him. Didn't mean he did it, but I was a little bit thrown off by his calm, cool demeanor and his lack of questioning. He wasn't, 'Will you call me back? Can I have one of your cards? What are you guys doing now?' Quote. Bueller further described Scott's behavior as a strange combination of polite and arrogant, disaffectedly distant, and impatiently irritable. He didn't seem like a man who was crushed or even greatly disturbed by his wife's disappearance and possible death." Laci's family defended Scott at this point, describing him and Laci as the ideal couple. And at first, all of this generally makes sense. But the shift happens fast, because almost immediately attention turns not just to what happened that day, but to Scott himself, his timeline, his behavior, and what investigators begin to uncover about his life outside of that home. While Laci was missing, while search efforts were intensifying, it came out that Scott had been having an affair with a woman named Amber Frey. The nationwide media coverage produced several tips and possible sightings, one of which was from a woman who identified herself as Scott's girlfriend. So it is not looking good for him. On December 30th, 2002, Amber Frey informed detectives she had met Scott on November 20th of 2002, so about a month or two prior to Laci's disappearance and about 3 months prior to Laci's due date with their baby. Scott was introduced by a friend to Amber Frey, a Fresno massage therapist, and the two began a romantic relationship. She told detectives that he had said he was single when they met in November. Additionally, and even more wild, Amber told detectives Scott said on December 9th that he was a widower and this Christmas would be his first without his wife. If you recall, Laci went missing on Christmas Eve, which is chilling that he said his wife was dead 2 weeks before she disappeared. Based on the dates and information Amber provided, detectives now believed Scott began planning to kill Laci 2 weeks before Laci's disappearance. That detail doesn't prove anything on its own, but it changes the shape of the story. Hoping Scott would confess or reveal information about his involvement in Laci's disappearance, detectives gave Amber a device with which to record her conversations with Scott. On January 15, 2003, detectives informed Laci's immediate family of Scott's affair with Amber. Upon learning of Scott's involvement with Amber Frey, Sharon Roca, Laci's mother, told detectives she believed Scott killed Laci. On January 24th, Sharon, Ron, and Laci's brother Brent held a press conference in which Brent said Scott had, in a phone call on January 16th, told Brent he was having an affair with a woman in Fresno. Brent also said that he and his family have withdrawn their support of Scott due to his lack of communication and cooperation. Later that same day, Amber Frey held a press conference and explained her role in the investigation. So by the time Laci is reported missing, Scott is still speaking with Amber, still pretending, still telling her he's traveling, still maintaining a version of his life that doesn't include a missing pregnant wife. And as investigators begin recording their calls, you hear something that's hard to ignore. He sounds normal, detached even, not like someone whose wife had just disappeared. And that becomes one of the most powerful and most debated pieces of this case, because it's not physical evidence, it's behavior. On April 13th, 2003, about 4 months after the affair became public knowledge, 2 people walking their dog found the body of a male fetus on San Francisco Bay shore. The following day, a jogger spotted a human torso approximately 1 mile from where the body of the fetus was found. On April 18th, 2003, DNA tests verified the bodies were Laci and her unborn son Connor. It should be noted where the bodies were found was near where Scott reportedly had gone fishing. The autopsies on both bodies were performed by forensic pathologist Dr. Laci Peterson, with no relation to anybody else in this case. Although a judge sealed the autopsy results, an anonymous Associated Press source revealed Connor's body had minor decomposition and a length of nylon cord wrapped around his body. The source of how the cord became wrapped around Connor's body could not be conclusively determined. Laci's body was missing her head, arms, and most of her legs, her internal organs, and was severely decomposed. The autopsy revealed Laci had 2 cracked ribs and some cracked neck bones, but that her uterus and cervix were intact. Neither Laci's date of death nor whether the broken ribs and neck bones occurred post-mortem could be conclusively determined. The missing head and limbs led to rumors that Scott had dismembered Laci beforehand, but Dr. Laci Peterson found no human-made incisions. He stated forensic pathologists testified the missing organs and disarticulation were conditions consistent with the body weighted at the wrists and ankles and submerged in seawater for several months. Unfortunately, Laci's head and extremities were never recovered. Dr. Peterson concluded Connor had died in utero, and his body was expelled from Laci due to decomposition, so not like he had been delivered or cut out or something along those lines. The discovery of Laci's and Connor's bodies changed the case status from missing person to homicide and allowed the detectives to expand their investigation of Scott Peterson as the prime suspect. The FBI and Modesto Police Department performed forensic searches of the Peterson home. Using mitochondrial DNA testing, the FBI linked a hair wrapped around a pair of pliers found in Scott's fishing boat to hairs recovered from Laci's hairbrush. Police searched Scott's truck, toolbox, and warehouse and found a homemade concrete anchor in the boat that Scott had used to go fishing, supposedly that morning. Guys, get this though. This boat that Scott Peterson was using was purchased 2 weeks before he had reported Laci missing. So Laci had never actually even been on this boat for a hair to be found. Scott told detectives he used a 90-pound bag of concrete to make one boat anchor and used the rest of the concrete to repair his driveway. When Detective Henry Dodge Hendy searched Scott's warehouse on December 27th, he found cement powder on the boat trailer and 5 circular marks matching the size and shape of the bucket used to make the anchor. Hendy also found a sledgehammer and a dustpan covered with cement powder. Prosecutors alleged Scott made 5 anchors and used 4. One tied to each of Laci's wrists and ankles to sink Laci's body in San Francisco Bay. After Scott was arrested, police searched the San Francisco Bay for the anchors, but nothing was found. Police increased their surveillance of Scott Peterson, following his car and monitoring his location by listening to his cell phone calls. Since Peterson had switched vehicles and was less than 30 miles from the Mexican border, detectives were certain Peterson was planning to flee to Mexico. Said Detective Bracchini in a 2017 interview, "We've got to find Scott right now. He told me he was at Brooks Island, and that's where the bodies come up. I believe it was premeditated. He planned it. San Diego was pretty darn close to the Mexican border. Scott knew the area pretty well. That's where his parents lived, and that's where he had lived. So it wasn't like he was going to have to get on MapQuest to figure out a way to get to Tijuana." On April 18, 2003, detectives arrested Peterson at Torrey Pines Golf Course. Scott had dyed his hair and beard blonde, and his vehicle was packed with equipment and supplies, including nearly $15,000 in cash, Viagra tablets, camping and survival equipment, several changes of clothes, 4 cell phones, and 2 driver's licenses, his and his brother's. Lee Peterson, Scott's father, explained Scott used his brother's license to get a San Diego resident discount at the golf course, and was living in his car to avoid media attention and harassment. Police and prosecutors alleged the switched car, dyed hair, money, phones, driver's license, and camping equipment indicated Peterson was trying to disguise himself and flee to Mexico. Detectives Bracchini and Bueller drove Peterson back to Modesto, where Peterson was booked into the county jail. On April 21, 2003, Peterson was arraigned and charged with 2 felony counts of murder with premeditation and special circumstances, to which he pleaded not guilty. Because of intense publicity and community involvement, the judge moved the trial to San Mateo County to avoid defense accusations of juror bias and ensure Peterson received a fair trial. By the time Scott Peterson went to trial in June of 2004, the case wasn't unfolding in a vacuum. It had already been shaped by months of media coverage, by public opinion, and by a growing sense that people had already understood what happened. From the start, the prosecution made their theory clear. Scott killed Laci Peterson because he wanted out of his marriage, and because of his relationship with Amber Frey. They focused heavily on his behavior in the days before and after Laci's disappearance, including the fact that he told others he had been golfing, not fishing, and that he had asked police whether cadaver dogs had been used in the park, where Laci was believed to have walked. The defense didn't deny the affair. In fact, they acknowledged it directly, calling Scott a cad. But they argued something different, that being unfaithful was not the same as being a murderer. And they pushed back hard on the idea that Scott would throw away his entire life for a relationship that only lasted a few weeks. They also accused investigators of locking onto Scott too early, pointing to small inconsistencies like a dispute over whether a TV segment Laci may have been watching that morning actually aired. A detail that seems minor, but in this case becomes part of a larger argument, that the investigation may have been shaped by assumption. Because again, there was no direct evidence tying Scott to the crime. So the prosecution built their case through accumulation. They presented witnesses who described Scott as emotionally detached during the search, unresponsive to Laci's family, and behaving in ways that didn't align with someone who was missing his wife. They highlighted his changing appearance, the purchase of a new vehicle under his mother's name, his attempts to sell the home, and even adding pornographic TV channels days after Laci's disappearance. Okay, let's chill, bro. Individually, none of these prove a crime, but together they begin to form a narrative. The prosecution also introduced physical and scientific elements, including a hair found on Scott's boat that was linked to Laci through mitochondrial DNA, expert testimony suggesting Laci's body could have ended up in the bay where Scott had been fishing, and a theory that Scott used homemade cement anchors to weigh her body down. But even those points weren't definitive. Experts acknowledged their findings were probable, not precise, and crucial pieces, like the alleged anchors, were never recovered. The defense now leaned into that uncertainty. They challenged the reliability of the mitochondrial DNA testing of the hair sample, the lack of clear forensic link, and the idea that the timeline was as fixed as the prosecutors claimed. They also raised alternative possibilities, including reported sightings of Laci after Scott had left the house, and the theory that she may have been abducted or taken while walking the dog, hence why the dog would be running loose in the neighborhood. At one point, they even suggested she could have been alive for days. But those theories faced a problem. They required the jury to believe in something that wasn't clearly supported, while the prosecution's case offered something else, a story that already felt complete. Even during the trial, there were complications. Jurors were dismissed, one for discussing the case externally, another during deliberations for conducting independent research. At one point, even the jury foreman asked to be removed. This wasn't a clean, controlled process. It was tense, messy, and closely watched. On November 12, 2004, the jury finally came to a verdict and found Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree murder of Laci and second-degree murder of their unborn son, Connor. And when jurors later explained their decision, they didn't point to one defining piece of evidence. They described it instead as hundreds of small puzzle pieces that together formed a complete picture. Scott was sentenced to death. He arrived at San Quentin State Prison in the early morning hours of Thursday, March 17, 2005. And if this case felt finished in 2005, it didn't stay that way, because legally this story kept moving. After his conviction and death sentence, Scott Peterson automatically entered the appeals process. Years later, his legal team filed a detailed appeal arguing that the trial itself had not been fair. They pointed to the intense media coverage, decisions made by the judge, and concerns about how jurors were selected. Essentially asking, was this verdict reached cleanly, or was it shaped before the trial even began? In 2020, the California Supreme Court revealed that appeal, and their decision is important because they did not overturn the conviction, they upheld it. But they did overturn his death sentence, not because of new evidence, not because they found he didn't do it, but because how jurors were dismissed during the trial. Specifically, jurors who had concerns about the death penalty were removed without fully determining whether they could still be fair. And legally, that matters, because it speaks to the right to have an impartial jury. So the result is a split outcome. The conviction stands, but the punishment is changed. In 2021, Scott Peterson was officially resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, which is where he remains today. No longer on death row, but still convicted, and still serving a life sentence. But even that isn't the end. And this is probably why we've heard so much about this case, just because it's kind of still continuing to go on, and there's just kind of a lot of questions around it. Alongside the direct appeal, his legal team also filed something called a habeas petition, and this is different. Because while an appeal looks at what may have gone wrong during the trial, a habeas petition can introduce new claims, new arguments, new angles. In this case, those claims included allegations that a juror may have been dishonest during selection, and arguments that Laci may have been seen alive after Scott left that day. But when those claims were reviewed, they were ultimately rejected. A judge ruled there wasn't enough evidence to support juror misconduct, and that the concerns raised didn't meet the threshold needed to overturn the conviction. And then, even more recently, the case took another turn. So, as recent as 2024, the LA Innocence Project stepped in. They took on Scott Peterson's case, arguing that there may be evidence that hadn't been fully explored, that something may have been missed or overlooked. They pushed for additional DNA testing, for broader access to evidence, and for taking another look. The response from prosecutors was immediate. They argued this wasn't necessary, that the evidence had already been tested multiple times, and that the case had already been proven. And what happened next is telling. A judge allowed limited testing, just one item, a piece of duct tape found on Laci's clothing, but everything else was denied. Then, later that year, the defense was granted access to some additional evidence for post-conviction review, which sounds significant, and it is, but it's not the same as overturning anything. And as of 2025, a major appeal connected to those efforts was denied. All of this to say, the conviction still stands, the sentence still stands, and the case legally remains intact. So, where does that leave things? Not undone, not resolved differently, but still being questioned. I just keep coming back to how early the certainty started in this case. Before the bodies were found, before the trial, before the full picture was even assembled. People already felt like they knew, and maybe they were right. But that's not really the question that lingers. Because since that conviction, the story hasn't stayed as final as it once seemed. The case wasn't built on a single piece of undeniable proof. It was built on accumulation. And once the story felt complete, how often do we go back and pull it apart again? Sometimes the most unsettling cases aren't the ones we don't have answers for. They're the ones that we do have answers for, and we still aren't entirely sure how we got there. Thanks for listening today. If you want to support the show, check it out on Patreon. And otherwise, I will see you next week. Stay curious. Thanks for listening to Kat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.